Okay, sure, thank you. And good afternoon and welcome everyone to the U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking webinar on the equality model. I'm Miriam Mueller and I'm the chair of the Education Working Group for U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking, which organizes these webinars. U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking recently released a statement in support of the equality model approach to prostitution. And our hope is that this webinar will help educate you, our members, on why we took this stand and to offer a chance to address any questions you may have. This webinar will be recorded and you will be sent a link to the webinar in a few days. And during the webinar, you will be muted and in listeners only mode. However, we do value your input and your questions, and these may be will be addressed during the last 20 minutes or so of our time together. To pose a question or to comment on what is being discussed, please use your Q&A box. And also on your screen, you'll see a small box that states either speaker's view or gallery view. And you want to be on a speaker's view in order to see the PowerPoint slides throughout the webinar. And so now I'll hand this over to Jennifer Raisley, the Executive Director for U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking, and who will introduce our presenter, Dr. Melissa Farley. Okay, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Marianne. And thank you all for joining us today. I wanted to briefly just start by kind of recapping what brought us here to this webinar and this particular topic today. Almost about a year ago, the Board of Directors for U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking decided that we needed to do some more internal education about a lot of these different approaches to prostitution as it relates to our mission of trying to end human trafficking and support survivors. And so we engaged over a series of months in learning about the topic, about a lot of the different approaches and arguments between partial decriminalization, full decriminalization, the current policies of full criminalization, in order to really understand what is most aligned with our mission and values as an organization to be able to participate in a lot of the public discourse that's happening right now, and also engage in advocacy issues that we're seeing pop up in many different cities and states across the country. Ultimately, after this process of learning and conversation and discernment, the Board of Directors agreed that the proposal and approach most in line with our values and our vision of a world without human trafficking that honors the human dignity of all people is this approach of the equality model, also known as the Nordic Model. That's a form of partial decriminalization, where it offers support rather than criminalization for those who are prostituted or are trafficked, who are targeted by this type of violence, while it still holds responsible those who are perpetuating the violence, the pimps and the traffickers, the brothel owners, and the Johns themselves. And so we are thrilled to have with us today to help us understand even more this particular approach to ending trafficking and responding to prostitution, as well as, helping to equip us to be better advocates in this field. As I mentioned, seeing that there are more and more policies towards full decriminalization or legalization popping up around the country. Unfortunately, one of the panelists who is going to join us today to share about her work in New York, Melanie Thompson, is under the weather and she's not going to be able to join us today, but she did say she would send some follow-up resources to continue to support our ongoing education. However, I am thrilled that we do have with us Dr. Melissa Farley. Dr. Farley has been a practicing clinical psychologist for 50 years. She's written over 40 peer-reviewed articles on prostitution and trafficking, as well as 2 books. In 1995, she founded the Prostitution Research and Education, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to research, education, and policy consultation on commercial sexual exploitation and its impact on women, men, and children. PRE offers a free library of resources on their website, which we'll also be sure to share with all of you as a follow-up email. There are a lot of great papers and resources to learn more on that website. The research that PRE has done has been used by governments all over the world, including South Africa, Canada, New Zealand, Ghana, Spain, Sweden, Korea, the UK, and of course, the United States. Dr. Farley has also consulted with several cities in the US as they craft new policies to deal with the increasing evidence that violence is at the heart of prostitution, and as cities confront men's demand for prostitution, which creates and expands markets for prostitution and sex trafficking. So without any further ado, Dr. Farley, welcome, and thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Jennifer and Marianne, thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it a lot. I'm really happy to be here. If there's anything we need in this world right now, all of us, it's allies in the struggle to abolish prostitution. We need to work together, and that's at the heart of what I'm going to talk about today. Jennifer, tell me if I am not the right button or something. I'm going to go now to screen share and show you some slides while I talk. Okay. Are you seeing them?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay, thank you. I call it the Nordic model, but I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute. In order to understand the Nordic model law on prostitution, I think we need to look at the history of the law, how and why the Swedes passed this amazing law in 1999, and what makes it so compelling to those of us who care deeply about basic human rights. Those of us who care about ending violence against women. I'll be honest, I love this law. It's a wonderful law, and it's given me hope for about 20 years now. Although right now, we're in one of the most difficult times I've ever seen in terms of the abolitionist movement in the world, but especially in the United States. I'm going to talk about how the law was developed, what it was based on, what countries have already passed it. In the US, we're a little behind in terms of progressive social and legal approaches to prostitution. So right now, 8 countries have passed the Nordic model law: Sweden, Iceland, Norway. That's why it was called the Nordic model, because the first 3 were all Nordic countries. And then a few years later, Canada, Northern Ireland passed it. In 2016, the French passed the Nordic model law, and they deserve special credit for some of the provisions of that law that are unique and different from other passages of the Nordic model law. Republic of Ireland and then Israel in 2018 have also passed the law. What are the essential elements of the Nordic model law? I'm flipping this on its head because in the last few years, it's come to my attention, both by allies and opponents of decriminalization. It's come to my attention that if we don't provide funding for exit services and we just arrest sex buyers, we're harming the women in additional ways. So on the advice of survivors that I work closely with, and on the advice of frontline service providers that are providing exit services, I emphasize the first component of the Nordic Model law to be provision of exit services to prostituted women who want them. These must be funded and up and running when sex buyers are arrested. In other words, if you arrest a sex buyer, you are, and this is what we've been criticized for, those of us who supported end demand legislation or focused almost exclusively on arresting sex buyers. We've been criticized because in some cases, what that does is deprive a woman of her next month's rent. Now, is that the whole problem? No, but I hear them. And we have to put ourselves in the perspective of extremely marginalized human beings that have very few options for their survival needs. So I think number one is the most important element of the Nordic Model law. Two, we need to decriminalize those who are paid for in prostitution. You're going to hear me use some slightly awkward, different language. Please bear with me. And if it doesn't make sense to you, ask me and I'll try to explain it. I don't use the word decriminalize those who are selling sex because that confuses people. They think you're talking about pimps. We're not talking about decriminalizing anybody but the woman, child, young man, trans person who's paid for in prostitution. Third element of the Nordic model, also called the equality model law, is hold sex buyers accountable. And accountability can certainly be a range of things. Put them in jail for 5 hours is the best deterrent in the world because they hate being jailed, like most of us, of course. Hold sex buyers accountable by jailing them, confiscating their car, arresting them. Although in the US, these arrests are usually misdemeanors, which is like a slap on the wrist. It doesn't mean a thing really to them. It's like jaywalking. In Sweden, the arrest of sex buyers is equivalent to our felonies in the United States, and that's a good thing. Melanie probably would have told you that in New York, when they tried to escalate the level of criminality of buying sex in New York, boom, the politicians came down on that. They went from a class C to a class D misdemeanor, and they wouldn't go near a felony, you know. And think about that third one, would you please, for a minute? Think about the fact that in the United States, if someone in a cold part of the US steals a $200 jacket to stay warm, that's a felony. If they steal 6 bottles of liquor, that's a felony. But if they buy a human being to use for sex, that's a misdemeanor every place. It says a lot about how everybody looks at people in prostitution. So how did the Swedes get this law passed? It was passed, first of all, after 10 or 15 years of research on the harms of prostitution. By the time this law came up in the Swedish parliament, they had their ammunition ready to roll, and they had research. They had educated politicians. There was a prevalent feminist perspective on life in Sweden at the time. Feminists had a large influence on other aspects of violence against women. And this law came out of an understanding of the intrinsic harms of prostitution that are a lot like battering, domestic violence, rape, and childhood sexual assault and incest. The Swedes understood the similarity in different forms of violence against women. Once prostitution is understood as a human rights violation and as structural violence against women, the legal approach of the equality model makes sense, but you have to educate people. And today we are up against a flood of propaganda that says sex work is work, that says being a porn star is a great way to make a living if you're poor and don't have a good education. And I'm sure we could talk for hours about that. But let me talk about the history, a little more about the history of the Swedish law. Swedish and Norwegian social scientists conducted many years of research. They learned about the harms of prostitution by interviewing many survivors. That compelling knowledge was passed on to the parliament, which at the time was 50% female. Think about that, you all. A parliament, the highest level of government, half women. I once asked Sweden's Minister of Gender Equality, how did you pass that law? And the first thing she said to me was, it's because the government has 50% women. Interesting political perspective and very important, I think. There are a multitude of harms that are perpetrated against women in prostitution. If you think about everything bad that can happen to a woman or girl, that's what prostitution is. Childhood neglect, childhood sexual abuse, incest, paid for sexual assault, which means she was prostituted as a kid, emotional abuse, lack of educational opportunity, lack of protection, rapes throughout her life, domestic violence, and all of these sexist acts of violence and neglect are most often combined with the relentless brutality of racism and poverty. Today, on top of all that, of course, she's flooded with social media, which tell her that she should be proud of being a slut. Let me just say that this photograph, which has always helped me understand what it feels like to be in prostitution. This young woman is in Mexico City. She's surrounded by at least 20 sex buyers or possible sex buyers. I frankly, I can't imagine how terrifying that must be for her. She's in La Merced, which is an area of Mexico City that women are trafficked to, and they stand like birds on a telephone pole at a set distance apart with pimps who have German shepherds on leashes at the ready to take care of anybody who tries to escape. I noticed after a few years of showing this slide that the photographer, Kimberly Aquaro, she shot from the roof of a nearby building. Why? It wasn't safe to be in that street at all. I've been in that street, and it is very, very dangerous. The predatory vibe is just palpable. So these kind of harms cause huge damage to women in prostitution. The damage has now been documented by many research studies. And if you're working against the Nordic, if you're working against decriminalization of pimps and sex buyers and pro-equality model, you really need to know that there's a ton of research out there now that documents the harms of prostitution. Symptoms of emotional distress and all kinds of prostitution, indoor, outdoor, legal, illegal, decriminalized, any type of prostitution. The symptoms of emotional distress are off the chart. Depression, suicidality, PTSD, dissociation, eating disorders, drug and alcohol abuse. And how does prostitution make women feel? It makes her feel like she is nothing at all. This is how the scholar of slavery in the United States described the impact of slavery. It causes what this girl is describing in her own words. Orlando Patterson said, slavery causes something called social death. And that's what prostitution does to somebody. She turns into what one sex buyer said to Victor Malarek, I was buying a product. They didn't exist as people. They were just whores. Or as a man I interviewed said, when I asked him, how would you explain prostitution? He said, well, prostitution is renting an organ for 10 minutes. And in that moment, I knew I had a better understanding of what we're talking about. So keep in mind, moving on to some of the more legal issues here, keep in mind that sex trafficking is coercing or selling a person into a situation of sexual exploitation like pornography or prostitution. Please keep in mind, pimping is trafficking. 84% of adults in prostitution are pimped or trafficked. And that's why those of us who work in this field say most of the time on the ground, from the perspective of the victim, you can't tell the difference between prostitution and trafficking. And that statistic, which has been published in a law journal, lets us know why. Because most everybody in prostitution is being pimped. Pimping is coercive, violent control. The word trafficking, in my opinion, has not helped us a lot in the abolitionist movement. Everybody uses the word now. The US federal law, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, is really deeply inadequate because it only covers the most extreme cases. And even in those cases, the TVPA requires the victim to prove that she was coerced or tricked. From the very beginning, I have felt that was at best naive and rather, I'll just stick with the word naive. I'll try and be polite. It's naive. And if you talk to police are afraid to be in the same courtroom as traffickers. Why then are we asking victims of international organized crime and US organized crime, Hells Angels, Bandidos, Crips, Bloods, all of the rest of them, Aryan Nation, why are we asking victims to sit in a court of law when they sometimes have no resources other than the pimp? Because when we fail to provide housing and support for marginalized human beings, guess who comes along and provides them with support? Pimps do. Pimps provide housing in the United States. So I think it's upside down to expect the victim to testify in these situations. So once the harms of prostitution are understood, what kind of law makes sense? If we understand, and I hope this logic helps you in your work on behalf of the Nordic model or the equality model law, I hope this helps you track the logic, which has been helpful to me. If you recognize that domestic violence has a perpetrator and a victim, what do? We punish the batterer. If we recognize that rape has a perpetrator and a victim, we punish the rapist. And if we recognize that prostitution has a perpetrator and a victim, we punish the sex buyer. That is pretty compelling logic, and the Swedes got it. The politics of this are that trafficking is a business, and the aim of the Swedish government is to try to destroy the market. They put it very bluntly, and I have always loved the Swedish detectives who put out some wonderful information about prostitution and trafficking. Another Swedish expert said, men arrested for buying sex can be used as witnesses to testify in human trafficking cases. If you start with a customer, you can prove the whole chain. And he was absolutely right. If you look at the cell phones of arrested sex buyers, you can see how they got to where they are. They'll go to a porn site. On the porn site will be advertised, what's your zip code? We can have a cute girl that is right near you at your house in 10 minutes. I mean, online today is where trafficking happens. So let me because Jennifer asked me to talk about this, and I agree with her. It is so important. People are very, very confused about this issue, and it's not by accident. It's because pimps and their political allies are expert, really, in making sure we get very confused about all this stuff. The more confused we are, the more difficult it will be for us to focus on what's happening right in front of us, which many, many people intuitively understand. Many people understand. They take one look at a woman that's prostituting and they get it. She has no options. She hates being there. She's embarrassed. She's humiliated, and she really would like to get out. You can, if you're able to talk with women who are in that situation, that's what you find out in the first 10 minutes. But as Pat Butler said a number of years ago, power is not having to make sense in order to be believed. And so what happens is that sex trade promoters compartmentalize porn, prostitution, and trafficking into different conceptual categories. Why do they do that? Because at heart, they're interested in making money. And that helps them focus legal battles on saying, oh, no, 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 trafficking is terrible. We all need to stop that. Prostitution of children is terrible. We all need to stop that. But voluntary, freely chosen prostitution that women are using for a nice job, we need to leave that alone, folks, because somewhere, someplace, there are 25 women who freely chose prostitution as a job in your city, and we're going to offer them a law to protect them. Oh, and by the way, the law destroys any protection than that other 90% of women who want to get out tell us they want. And that is the fact. Don't let anyone tell you that they're just a few trafficked women and 90% are voluntary escorts in high-end prostitution. It's simply not true. 90% of women are in it because of urgent financial need. They need housing. They're almost through their college education and they have no more money and they really need to get a degree to be able to get a job, to be able to support kids. And they think that sugar daddy prostitution is going to be okay for them to just make $5,000. That's not voluntary. None of that is voluntary. And if you ask anyone, would you rather be earning money any other way if you could get that much pay? Of course, they will tell you yes. Prostitution morphs and shifts form to accommodate pressure from state authorities, social activists, donors of HIV prevention projects, while still trying to maintain access to clients and profitability. I'm not going to go into that a lot more, but let me cover some words that hide the truth about prostitution and trafficking. Voluntary prostitution. That suggests somewhere that there's a large number of people who volunteer for it. Forced trafficking. That hides a lot of coercion and violence. Sex work, I think, is a double lie because prostitution for the person in it is not sex for her, and it's not work. It's a human rights violation. And even if we try to use that word to dignify the person, and by the way, those of you in frontline service provision, I'm not telling you you have to give a chastising lecture to a woman who is trying to get help or a meal or a bed for the night. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying when we educate our allies, we can't use the word sex work. We've lost the battle right there because that disappears the violence and abuse that is intrinsic to prostitution. Prostitution is also referred to as migrant sex work, and women in prostitution are called beautiful merchandise. It's called compensated dating. Women are called disadvantaged women or flexible labor or irregular migration. It gets more and more fuzzy and confused when you use some of the terminology that the pro-sex work groups do internationally. And then today, the word sugar daddy prostitution's actually been changed into a verb, and women refer to sugaring, which means they're prostituting, or dating website. Oh, goody! I'm at a place where I can go to some details about advocacy. I want to talk about strategies to counteract the campaigns that we are all facing today to legalize or decriminalize prostitution in the US. Let me just say, for starters, and if this is helpful, decriminalized prostitution is a form of legal prostitution. It's all, why do I say that? Because legal prostitution removes any sanctions against a person who's prostituting. In other words, let's take the state of Nevada, for example, prostitution is heavily regulated by zoning. So is decriminalized prostitution. You're never going to have decriminalized prostitution without zoning. It's heavily zoned in New Zealand, where, and the obvious fact is that prostitution is zoned into the neighborhoods of who? Into the neighborhoods of women who are recent immigrants, into the neighborhoods of people of color, and into the neighborhoods of poor people. Decriminalized prostitution is never zoned into the neighborhoods of the city fathers. And in New Zealand, in Auckland and Wellington, the big cities in New Zealand right now, prostitution is zoned away from schools. It's zoned away from churches. That is a form of legal prostitution. So just so you know that, people are confused about that difference. So we can't fight systems of prostitution without exited survivors. And like Marianne and Jennifer, I'm sorry, Melanie couldn't be here today because her voice is important. And everywhere where I am actively involved in campaigning for the abolition of prostitution, at my side or in front of me is an exited survivor who has a voice to oppose prostitution. Is that any survivor? No. Survivors are just like the rest of us. They have a range of skills. Some are political organizers, some are number crunchers, some are fabulous speakers, some are background organizers. So we all need to find the skills of, oh yeah, I was going to go to the No on K website. We all need to find the skills that we're best at because it takes so many people struggling against this. So be able to define, here's a tactical suggestion. Be sure you can define trafficking and prostitution in your own words. Do not use the words of somebody at an anti-trafficking conference who told you what the federal law in the US, how that's defined, how that defines prostitution or trafficking. I mean, we have a fairly appalling situation in the US where a federal Department of Justice official said, quote, "It is our policy of the DOJ not to prosecute cases of adult prostitution." This is a man who told us some years back when Elliot Spitzer was arrested, he told us that he was not going to support enforcing the laws of the United States. So we do have a problem, and be sure you can talk in your own words about prostitution. Let yourself feel the despair and the hopelessness and the fury about doing this work, because we all feel it. It's excruciating. It's very painful that we're being shoved backwards right now. But let yourself feel that and then move forward, and don't ever, ever give up. There's always something you can do. And we have to work at a local level. I asked Jennifer if I could put this up, and I'm going to go to stop share for a minute. Then I'm going to go to get onto noonk.net. Jennifer, now do I go back to share?
Yes. So now you want to pull up your share screen again, but selecting the web page that you have up.
End of slideshow. Okay, where is my share screen? Where's my share thing? Okay, got to get out of PowerPoint. Okay, here we go. And share. Can you see it now?
Yes.
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 Great. So now you're looking at a website we set up when we were fighting decriminalization in San Francisco back in 2008. We had resources and we had time, which I am well aware of right now, because there's so much political energy pushing in favor of decriminalizing pimps and traffickers. Most of us don't have the leisure, the resources, and the support we had back in 2008. But just to let you know what we did, if you're working with anybody who is a website wonk, get them on board fast, because it really helps organizing to put up a website about your campaign. We named our campaign No on K. That was a legal proposition in California to stop enforcing laws on prostitution in San Francisco. And we actually had a PR consultant, which was worth gold, who said, you've got to talk about trafficking and pimping. You can't talk about sex buying because not enough of the population is going to understand enough. Everyone opposes decriminalizing pimps. And over the years, I've found that's an important thing. Does it gall me? Yes. Did I argue with this PR guy who said, you can't talk about prostitution, Melissa. You can't talk about sex buyers. You just have got to talk about human trafficking, human trafficking. You have to say things like, San Francisco is going to put out a welcome mat for pimps and traffickers. That's what we did. We then put up on the website editorials that came out opposing decriminalization from the San Francisco Chronicle. We put out the full text with our critique of Prop K. And our flyer, we uploaded our flyer, Prop K is dangerous and deceptive, which it really was, and which every single one of the propositions and proposals that I'm seeing in the US today, they're all deceptive, they're full of lies. And we emphasize that in our campaign. This was part of a pamphlet we passed out to individuals in public transportation. We stood for hours passing out pamphlets. And we, on the left side of this website, we have resources, which is you all have, I'm sure. We had videos for people who like to look at videos. We have quotes. Guess who in 2008 came out against prostitution? Senator Barack Obama, believe it or not. And we quoted survivors. We quoted Kamala Harris, who was the district attorney at the time, and well-known newspaper. Probably our most important piece of this website was a list of opponents of Prop K. That is, people who said, no, don't decriminalize pimping or buying sex. And look at the list of groups. We updated our website daily to include groups that opposed decriminalize pimping. Groups, individuals, we put any big name we could find up on that, including up at the top, elected officials, supervisors, Bay Area officials, and then individuals, long list of individuals working against violence against women nationally and locally. That website is still up in case anybody finds it useful. So I'm going to jump back to just tell you, I think organization has to happen locally in your community. We all know that. The Manhattan District Attorney has just supported a de facto Nordic Model law because he announced that he's not going to arrest people in prostitution, but he is going to arrest both pimps and sex buyers. It's a fabulous move. There's lots of ways of doing this. Louisiana also had a win at the state level. That proposal to decriminalize prostitution was just withdrawn. Rights for Girls and a large coalition in Washington, D.C. just fought off decriminalization a couple of years ago in the district. Right now, you want to help us? We're in the middle of a brutal fight in Oakland that has just started up, and this is what's going to happen and is happening in many municipalities. There is a proposal called Revisioning Public Safety in Oakland that has probably 40 separate pieces, many of which are fabulous. Things like demilitarize the police, stop police overtime, put the Oakland city budget in more money into emergency mental health services so the cops don't have to be called. Sandwiched in the middle of all of these great police reform proposals was a little bitty resolution to stop enforcing California's laws on prostitution. This is how stealthy and clever they are. So local organizing is key. I'm going to stop here, Jennifer and Marianne, and please help me respond to questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Melissa. Really appreciate the wealth of information you bring in helping us to understand this issue better. I do just, want to let our members know who are watching this now or might be watching a recording later. Part of the document that the board created includes commitments, by taking this position, what are we committing to as an organization? And part of that is getting involved on, this advocacy level. And so I just want to encourage, one of the ways that all of our members can help us, knowing that you all are spread out throughout the United States, is to let us know if you're seeing or hearing about policy proposals in your city, in your state, that are trying to decriminalize prostitution, decriminalize pimping and the traffickers. Let us know. And then also let us know too, if there are other coalitions working in your area on the Equality Model or Nordic Model, trying to get that type of policy or legislation introduced, because we do want to be partnering more or offering our support where we can, knowing that this is happening around the country. So we do hope our members stay in communication with us and let us know what's happening in your local area. Please do go ahead and submit your questions that you have for Melissa in the question and answer box. We can start off with the first question that's in here, is if you could speak a little bit about the Freedom Network and the harm that they do as promoting anti-trafficking efforts globally.
Thank you, Jean Schaefer, for that question. Great question. Thank you. We have worked together for many, many years, Jean and I. The Freedom Network is a great example of the power of words to camouflage and deceive people. Don't be fooled. The Freedom Network sounds good. What could be better than the Freedom Network or groups like Anti-Slavery International or the Northern California Anti-Trafficking Network? I just made that one up. You need to know what the position of groups are, like the Freedom Network, as Jean brings up. You need to bring up the word prostitution. You cannot understand where they're coming from if you just talk about trafficking. They will talk in circles around you. You need to say, give them specific examples, challenge them. And what has happened with groups like the Freedom Network and many, many others is that they take this position. I oppose trafficking, but I support voluntary sex work or voluntary prostitution. Trafficking is coercive. Voluntary sex work isn't so bad. Let's don't talk about that. And of course, they ignore the statistics that I just cited, about 84% of those in prostitution who are adults being trafficked. So I agree with Jean's extreme concern about groups like the Freedom Network that are pushing pro-decrim legislation all over the US. Thank you.
Thanks. Any other questions that people might have about this particular model, about kind of what we're seeing, clarifying any of the terms that were used? There aren't currently any other questions there, so I just want to give people another minute or so if they're working on typing a question in to the question and answer box. I know it's a big topic and there are lots of different concepts that are included, so people might need to just sit with the information for a little bit too and absorb it.
I mean, Jennifer and Marianne, if there's something I wasn't clear about, oh, somebody's got a couple more in Q&A now, I see.
Yeah.
Jean. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Jean was just adding another organization, Amnesty International, which does so much great work, in so many other areas, but does take a different position on this particular issue than we do. I think Nancy asked a question about where does the stat come from? And Nancy, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think you're referring to the one about how many people are pimped, right? So where are you getting this stat about like 84% of people being pimped within traffic or within prostitution?
Sure. If you go to the Prostitution Research and Education website, prostitutionresearch.com, I'm trying to look it up right now as I'm speaking. And if you go to prostitutionresearch.com, go to the library. Well, let me see if there's an easier way. If you go to, let me just say the reference. It's from the Albany Law Review, and it is
Oh, I'm not sure if that's just on my end, but Melissa, you're frozen.
it was published in that law journal. We surveyed about 20 agencies and asked for their estimates. And the title of the article, I'm just gonna grab it and then throw it up on the screen. So you can see it. It's from an article called Online Prostitution and Trafficking. It's in Albany Law Review, and it was published in what year was that published? 2011 or 15? 2014. It was published in 2014. So I'll grab it and send it on. It's in a footnote and it lists everybody we interviewed. It's one of those law journal footnotes. But the average of all of the experts and agencies we interviewed was 84%.
Thank you so much. Any other final questions that anyone has? Go ahead and add those to the question and answer box.
I mean, Jean also mentioned the group Amnesty International. And again, I think you can't just look at somebody's website and see that they have a nice name like Amnesty International or World Health Organization or Global Alliance Against Trafficking in Women or Freedom Network. You can't just look at names of groups because they all sound good. You have to not only look at their mission statement, but you have to contact your friends like Jennifer or Jean Schaefer or me and ask them, what do you know about this group? And then you have to call them up and ask them, do you have a policy regarding prostitution. Do you think prostitution is voluntary sex work? How do you understand prostitution? I remember a big surprise I had some years back when I said to the director of Polaris, another organization that many people assume has an understanding of prostitution as violence against women. And they said, how come you aren't listing us in your agencies, Melissa? And I said, do you use the P word in your mission statement? And they said, no, we don't. We don't use the word prostitution in there. I said, well, when you do, that's when I'll list you, because that's a quick and easy litmus test for these groups that are anti-trafficking, pro-freedom, Amnesty International, is to ask them, what policy do you recommend with respect to prostitution? That's when you can find out what they really are advocating.
Great, thanks. We did get a couple more questions in. So for us as an organization, as we make our public stance known on this particular issue, should we anticipate or expect any backlash? And, do you have any recommended responses? You had mentioned standing with an exited survivor, as support for this approach, but any other suggestions as well?
Yes, there have been a number of publications that are absolutely wonderful on counteracting arguments that are promoting prostitution as reasonable work for poor women. And we've got them under, I think it's under quick facts on our website. Again, I will be happy to share URLs of those documents with Jennifer after this seminar is over. But I think, yes, you do have to be prepared for pushback. It's great to get together in small groups and practice with somebody tossing adversarial questions at you and answering them. I'll be honest, I was very, very intimidated at first. The last thing I wanted was to take on the pimps and their friends in public debates, and I avoided it for a long time. I finally decided, got to do it. During one of these campaigns back in Berkeley, we just had to get out there in communities who were discussing these issues. And so what I learned is it's once you get a set of facts and research on the harms of prostitution, once you can really cite the details of how badly prostitution harms human beings, you got 50% of the battle waged. But you got to know those, and they got to be good ones. I've seen some dicey stats thrown up, and I appreciate people asking, where did you get that 84% are pimped? Because it's a really good question. And if you ever cite that publicly, you're going to get challenged on it. Mm-hmm. So I'll have that. But look on the PRE website under quick facts. I think the Swedish Women's Lobby has a booklet on how to respond to these kinds of arguments. Many of us who are not survivors, in order to avoid someone saying, well, you don't know what you're talking about, Melissa, you've never been there, done that. There's a lot of ways to respond to that, including personal experience, and to talk about, I have occasionally talked about how I understand humiliation. And guess what? That's at the core of the experience of prostitution. And most of us have experiences of being profoundly humiliated that we'd rather not even talk about. But that's what prostitution is, I've come to understand, at its core. So let me just see, there might be a couple other questions, Jennifer.
Yeah, so Teresa, who's our new program director for the organization, lifts up that, there's the DA in Ann Arbor, Michigan, who recently passed an ordinance legalizing prostitution. She's part of a group that's been working, with him, and he just won't change, his mind or recognize how dangerous this is. Any recommendations for how else, they can engage him or, be working locally on this issue when there is, a DA or a legislator, someone in that position who just, refuses to hear the other side?
Oh, what a great question, Teresa. That's what we're in the middle of in Oakland. And that's where it comes down to local, local, local. Here's what I'm trying to do right now in Oakland as we speak. I'm trying to find out who are the most powerful people in the city of Oakland. How can I get to them? What do they think about prostitution? If I can get anybody that has any power, a philanthropist that everybody knows, a politician that is respected but doesn't have as much power as the DA, talk to that person. See if you can set up an educational seminar for either the community or for your allies or for just a select group of politicians who might lean on the DA. Do you have any friends in the DA's office? I ran into exactly that issue in Oakland. I should say we. I've been working with two other people on this, especially who deserve credit. Autumn Burris, a survivor, and Sarai Smith Mazariegos, who is also a survivor. And the three of us have put pressure on the Alameda County DA to make public statements. She finally came out against it, but I had to go into all of the people in her office, the juvenile justice assistant DA, the this, the that. Any DA's office has a lot of people. And so, Teresa, I'd say, do you have any friends in the DA's office? Are there community groups? I did a workshop a while back in Dallas, and there were 60, that's 60 community groups participating in a citywide support of offering women alternatives to criminalization. Everybody from, and these are people like substance abuse centers, homeless shelters, rape crisis shelters, mental health centers. We do have support opposing decriminalization from a mental health center in Alameda County. That's very important. Politicians are affected by numbers and budgets. One of the things we did way back in the day that I am plastering the Oakland City Council with right now is a statement from the Berkeley city manager, which said, if you decriminalize prostitution in the city of Berkeley, here's what's likely to happen: increased rapes, increased sexual violence, increased STDs, increased costs for the police department. So that affects politicians. It's about violence and it's about money. And I will send, Teresa, if you drop me a line, I'll send you that document, which you can quote in Michigan. I'm also willing to help out in any way I can. And I think there's others who will too. We could talk for an hour about local political organizing, couldn't we, Jennifer?
Definitely. Yeah, we might have to do another webinar on that sometime. But thank you so much. I think we are at time, so we will have to close for the time being, but so grateful for being willing to share with us and also being able to, kind of help fill the space with Melanie not being able to join us today. So thank you. There was a question just about additional resources. So I wanted to let everyone know, I will be sending a follow-up, email to everyone who registered with the link to view this if you want to go back and visit something later, but also, you know, some of the resources that Melissa mentioned, and then some resources that Melanie's going to be forwarding me as well. So we will have some additional resources to send you.
I'm
Dr.
putting
Ford,
my email address in the chat if anybody wants to look at that right now. Whoops, it just went to the panelists, sorry. I should,
oh, and attendees, I think.
oh, and attendees, it went to everybody, okay.
I think it just
Yeah.
went to us, but
Okay,
I'll
so-
copy it here and then. Great, thank you.
Teresa, write me and I'll share this letter and stuff with you.
Dr. Farley, thank you for all your information. It was a great presentation. And I want to thank all the attendees, all those attending our webinar. And I join Jennifer in inviting you to our next webinar. It's going to be on the impact of Catholic sisters on helping survivors thrive. And that will be held on May 25th at 1 p.m. Eastern. And until then, stay safe and healthy. And thank you again for attending.